Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
For the last session, we learnt about the Tetrad model of Marshall McLuhan, the Tetrad comprising enhancement, obsolescence, retrieval and reversal, the Tetrad model of communication, and we also demonstrated how McLuhan in furnishing his Tetrad model gives a break away from the deterministic approach to media technologies. So, we talked about the Tetrad model, and we also talked about the McLuhan's expression of like the medium is the massage, and we talked about what McLuhan means by massage rather than message, and what McLuhan calls the inventory of effects. So, if we are quickly recapping it, so McLuhan talks about the sensory impact and the ubiquity of some of these new media technologies, and we also heard McLuhan himself speaking on his Tetrad and inventory of effects. So, what we are going to do now in this session is to we have seen McLuhan speaking himself. So, we will try to extrapolate McLuhan's ideas onto the context of the internet. Like we will take some of McLuhan's ideas and try to consider whether the models, whether the theories that McLuhan provides would be able to adequately explain the new media technologies. So, we will take one example here, the case of journalism. So, we will zero in on the context of journalism, and we will see like journalism as a platform, journalism as a context, what happens when journalism integrates new media technology, like the old traditional form of media when it gives way to digital technologies and new media technologies, what happens to journalism, what changes do we get to see, and we will try to relate this in the context of the Tetrad model. And if you recall from the previous sessions, we were trying to understand what do some of these technologies endorse and simultaneously disapprove of, what they encourage and what they discourage, what they allow us to do, what they do not allow us to do. We discussed a bunch of examples starting from the smartphone, the smart class and so on and so forth, but then in terms of the simultaneity and in terms of the Tetrad model, we are going to zero our attention in onto the context of journalism. Yes. So, in other words, in the session that follows, we are going to consider what McLuhan calls the inventory of effects in the context of journalism as it gives way to new media technologies. So, prior to the advent of the new media, the most prominent form of journalism were professional journalism that presupposes the larger liberal democratic frameworks. I will write it here. So, prior to the emergence of the new media, we had this broadly speaking two forms of journalism, professional journalism and public journalism. So, professional journalism presupposes a large liberal democratic framework like the news corporations or the government gadget and so on and so forth. So, it is more like a very corporate institutional officialized platform. And number two, we have public journalism that incites the public to debate the most important issues which has got to do with civic responsibility, the country's democracy and so on and so forth. So, one can think of the 19th century nationalist newspapers, which broke away from the journalistic approaches that the British media or the government journals propagated. So, they were a break away from these approach, and they started to discuss public issues, civil issues, civil rights issues comprising democracy and so on and so forth. So, broadly speaking, we had these two forms of journalism before the emergence of the new media, professional journalism and public journalism. Now, with the new media in place, with the advent of the new media, we have again, very broadly speaking, I will remind you in this context that these are not exhaustive forms of journalism. We are broadly speaking trying to classify this into two subsets, so that we are better equipped to understand what changes the new media is making. But let me flag post this right at the onset, that these are not exhaustive forms of journalism. Anyhow, with the advent of the new media, we have another two forms of journalism, which is yes. Now, let me tell you what these two forms of journalism are. Citizen journalism is that does away with the citizen journalist divide. The citizen emerges as the journalist, wherein the division between the binary between the citizen and the journalist is blurred. The citizens decide what is news, and they discuss the news in groups, in collectives. So, citizen journalism is, one can imagine, as the local collectives that manage, maintain news websites. So, these are small, these are decentered, these are community based, and these mostly function in the form of collectives. So, in this context, one may think of community radio, like which like the now we have internet based community radios. That will be an example of citizens journalism. So, they are not supported, or they do not derive any form of support, endorsement or sponsorship from large media houses, media corporations, but they are small collectives, and they maintain and they manage their own networks and platforms of news dispensing. So, it is kind of an independent journalism, so to say, and one can think of this in short is referred to as the indie media. If you now think of the example of Kafila, some of you might be aware. So, it is a website, it is a collective, news collective, and it publishes articles, posts and news pieces which are somewhat against the grain. So, they have their own ideological dispensation, in the sense that, and if you recall the tagline of the website of Kafila's website, they say like kafila.org, and the tagline, and Kafila's tagline is run from big media. So, the tagline illustrates the nature, the characteristic of indie media or citizen journalism. They usually try to run away from big media houses and corporations, precisely because they function in the form of collectives that cater to the interests of smaller emancipatory groups. Number 2, we have algorithmic user monitoring journalism. This is what we call the So, this is a form of journalism where news pieces or news feed is supplied to the audience or the reader by algorithms. So, again like the kind of examples that we discussed for the last few sessions, we were talking about the eraser of the human interface. So, the bots as you know are computer programs which are able to perform tasks like human assigned tasks nevertheless. So, the bots are able to perform repetitive tasks with greater efficiency without requiring a human interface. Algorithmic journalism is a platform where news is served or supplied to the reader or the audience by the bots, by algorithms. They take care of whatever news they think is best suited for you. So, the kind of news feed that we have on our mobile phones, gadgets, tablets and other handheld devices. Think for example, the Google news feed in this context, there is no human interface involved whatsoever. So, it is the bots and the algorithm decide what news are going to show up on our feed, what news pieces are going to show up on the web pages. Discussing this 4 strands of journalism, what we are trying to get at is the shift away from traditional to new media. And in this context, we are going to look at a diagrammatic representation, a tabular representation of this schema of journalism. But before we get into that, we will invoke these 2 theories here, which will help us better understand the nature of journalism after the shift to new media. Yes, so in a while we are going to look at a tabular representation that will help us better understand this shift that impacts journalism in the era of new media. But before we get into that, let us keep alive these 2 theories, cultivation theory and agenda setting theory, that will be pertinent in understanding this shift. Now, cultivation theory, which is that like these 2 theories are specifically designed towards understanding these 2 forms of media. Now, cultivation theory is when people spend a lot of time, for example, before the television, or they read or they consume news from the newspaper. So, the more time they spend on a particular platform, be it the television, be it the radio, be it the newspaper, more naturalized is the ideology that comes with the set of the news platform. So, the more someone is watching TV, he or she tends to think whatever she watches on TV is true or real. So, in other words, the ideological implications, if you can recall some of our previous sessions in which we have discussed the political intent or the ideological intent of communication media, this is directly in conversation with the ideological implications. So, the more amount of time someone spends before the television, he or she tends to believe whatever that appears on screen, whatever she watches on the television is true. So, in other words, what I am trying to suggest is, what rather the cultivation theory is suggestive of, is the fact that it takes the ideology of the content of the news. So, whatever you read, whatever you see, whatever you hear on the radio, for example, you tend to think them as naturalized, as real, without being attentive to the fact that they are embedded with certain ideological dispensation. There are ideological apparatuses that work within the frameworks from within the news is conceived. That is the cultivation theory. And then we have agenda setting theory. Broadly speaking, when you see something which has been given more importance on certain media, you tend to think that is more important. If you if you watch that a certain news item is repeating on a certain channel, you tend to believe that this news item is more important than other things that is happening around you. So, this is what in short is like the agenda, and see these are mutually related. Now, if you recall our discussion on ideology and the political intent, the agenda setting theory and cultivation theory are symbiotic in the sense agendas are cultivated, and once you cultivate the agenda, that is conforming, that is very conformist, that conforms to the agenda. So, in other words, agendas are cultivated, and once you cultivate the agenda, the news recipient, the news reader, the citizens are conforming to the agenda with which the news item is dispensed. So, with that we will move on to the tabular representation. We will keep these two strands of theory, agenda setting theory and cultivation theory, in the back of our mind when we engage with the nuances of new media as we go ahead. So, this is a tabular representation of the journalistic models, and if you read the title of the table, it says journalistic models and their visions of the new audience. So, the expression new audience here, as you realize, is a play upon the expression new media. When you have new media, automatically you will have new audience. So, what we are trying to make sense of with the help of this diagram is to understand the nuances of new media, and by extension the subjectivity of the new audience. So, what is it that makes the new audience new? I mean, this is something we started the course with. We started probing into what is it that makes the new media new, and after having spent after having discussed new media for so many sessions, we are now getting into the subjectivity of the new audience. Before we get into the table, let me acknowledge the source too. Like, this is a table that C.W. Anderson furnishes in his article. The article is titled "From in the Media to Demand Media." Demand media is like algorithm based media, what we have discussed right now. So, his article is titled "From in the Media to Demand Media." So, this appeared in Michael Mandiberg edited The Social Media Reader, which was published in 2012, and C.W. Anderson as the author of this piece. He uses this diagram, and I have retrieved this diagram from page 86 of Michael Mandiberg's edited volume called The Social Media Reader. So, these, broadly speaking, what you see on your left are the four forms of journalism that we just talked about. On the top left hand column, you have professional journalism here, you have public journalism here, in the media. So, these two are what I refer to within the rubric like old or traditional media. So, with the new media, you have the number 3 and number 4, like in the media journalism and algorithmic journalism. So, these are the four forms of journalism on your left. On the horizontal axis on your top, you have the subjectivity, the subjectivity of the audience. So, the audience's relationship to journalism as. So, what you have here in this column is, you have to read it like this: the audience's relationship to professional journalism is therefore consumptive. So, this is the vertical axis, this is the horizontal axis. What you have here is the audience's relationship to journalism as the audience's internal relationship to itself. So, it is the audience relationship. So, look, the very last column, you have the audience's relationship to politics as. So, we have these three forms of relationship here on the horizontal axis. It is the audience journalism relation, the audience relation, and the audience agenda relation. When it says audience's relationship to politics, it means like audience and audience's relation with certain agenda, certain political imperatives. So, we will quickly look into how these relationships speak to each other and examine the subjectivity of the audience in the context of the new formats of media. So, in the context of professional journalism, if you remember, professional journalism is big media houses, big corporations, of official news dispensing agencies like government gadgets, big media corporations. So, the audience's relationship to professional journalism is consumptive agenda setting. Now, if you go back to some of our earlier lectures, as we said, like during in the context of the traditional old media, the agendas were set from top. It was a top down approach, participatory media approach that we have after the advent of the new media. It is not participative, it is a top down approach where people sitting at the top of broadcasting corporations, publication houses, they decide what is to be shown and what we as news readers, as audience, we ought to consume, or the audience's relationship to professional journalism is consumptive and agenda setting. Whereas, in the context of professional journalism, the audience's relationship to itself, the audience relationship is consumptive and atomistic. Atomistic because imagine in the context of the television, like you watch the television in an insular platform, like the television is a very individualistic device. So, was the radio. So, these are individualistic devices. The newspaper, imagine the newspaper as a platform, the newspaper as an artifact is meant to be read alone. So, it is consumed in isolation. So, this insularity characterizes professional journalism. So, it is a top down approach, people on the top of corporations decide the agenda and they feed it onto you, and as audience, as readers, we consume these in a very insular setup. The audience's relationship to politics therefore is, because the agenda is set by people at the top, because I consume the news in a very atomistic fashion, singularly in an insulated way, our engagement to politics, our relationship to politics is therefore disengaged or aggregated, which is what you have here. Now, come to public journalism. Public journalism is, as I said, like it is not the official institutional forms of media, but these are agenda setting nevertheless, in the sense that this concerns civic journalism, where public in the public sphere they discuss civic issues, civil rights, and so on and so forth. Contrary to the big media houses or the broadcaster, it is the public, they decide what is newsworthy. So, the audience's relationship to public journalism is deliberative. So, there is an aspect of deliberation here. The public is exerting its own will so far as to determine what is newsworthy. So, this is agenda setting, as I said, nevertheless, but this is deliberative to a great extent, because the public is deciding for itself what is ought to be consumed. The audience's internal relationship to itself, the audience relation in the concept of, in the context of public journalism is conversational, because people who are curious may look up, like this is kind of a public sphere where news agenda, news pieces, and what is news, and the decision about what is newsworthy is negotiated, decided, debated, and so on and so forth. So, it involves conversation and negotiation. So, therefore, the audience's internal relationship is conversational, whereas the audience's relationship to politics in the context of public journalism is engaged as opposed to disengaged in the context of professional journalism, because these are issues that the public, that the civil society, they themselves debate, negotiate, converse to bring on board. So, this is more engaged form of communication, and that is why it says here engaged, communicative via deliberation. So, we have discussed these two brands like professional journalism and public journalism with respect to traditional media. Now, off to new media, we have these two forms of journalism, in the media and algorithmic. Now, let us look into the audience subjectivity here. The audience's relationship to journalism, as in the media journalism, is participatory, agenda setting. Journalism provides audience with ammunition. Ammunition in the sense that people can even contradict. If you now recall the Kafila example, where it says, where the tagline says run from big media. So, public journalism as a infrastructure is somewhat complementary to professional journalism, like public, the civil society discusses issues which the professional journalism misses out. So, they take upon issues which are underrepresented, so to say, in the professional journalism, and they top it up. So, it is some kind of a complementary relationship that public journalism would have with professional journalism, as opposed to indie media. If I am wanting to stress on the word ammunition here, and I think C.W. Anderson here is stressing on the word ammunition within quotation marks, because our attention is being drawn into the fact that indie media journalism is somewhat retaliative, in the sense that with the new media technologies, with the internet compatible platform, with participatory democracy and so on and so forth, inasmuch as Kafila can say that they can run from new media, like indie media can also combat professional journalism in a way that they can set their own agenda, and they can retaliate, and they can contradict professional journalism to a great degree with the help of internet, with the help of participatory media technologies and so on and so forth. And therefore, the audience's relationship to itself, the audience relationship in the context of the indie media is agonistic, like it is not atomos. So, I think this is a play of word here. Instead of atomistic in the case of professional journalism, it is agonistic, in the sense that the audience is not very sure. It is witnessing, and it is occupying the public spherules. So, I will draw your attention to these two words here, like atomistic and spherules. Like an atom, the atom is like a small entity, as opposed to sphericule, which is also insulated, which is also a bubble, but sphericule is bigger than the atom. So, what C.W. Anderson is trying to push us to think through is the fact that the indie media also works in bubbles, and we will get to that. We will discuss in the next session. We are going to talk about filter bubbles and how our new media practices, even though it is participatory to a great extent, functions within bubbles. So, if professional journalism functions within atoms, small entities, individualized, insular, then indie media is also, it is not singular, it is not atomistic, but it functions in spherules, because people who set the agenda for in the media, as in smaller news websites and news collectives, these are like-minded people who cluster together and they coalesce similar ideas together. So, if you look into Scroll or Where, for example, as media platforms, they supply us with certain types of news content, which is generally left oriented, left leaning, as opposed to if you look into some of the American news pieces, like so if you look into the example of the Scroll or Where, for example, in this context, they are known to be dispensing left oriented ideological materials as news pieces. So, this is as opposed to an atom. So, this is not individual, but this is not this is not atomistic, but this is certainly spherules, and spherules because these are like-minded people, ideologically like-minded people who get along with each other. They form the sphericule, they form the bubble, where like-minded people who are ideologically inclined along similar axes, they cluster together, they coalesce their ideas to supply and source the news. This is why Anderson is calling these spherules as opposed to atoms. So, in the context of the indie media, the audience's relationship to politics therefore is engaged, confrontational and witnessing. Confrontational, as I said when we discussed the expression ammunition. So, it is combative, it is confrontational, because people can, as I said, can oppose certain contrary agendas, because they are empowered to do so. The last pattern we have, like the algorithmic journalism, and if you see the audience's relationship to algorithmic journalism is agenda setting, non-participatory, atomized. Non-participatory, again, like the kind of discussion that we are having, we are talking about with the advent of new media, the human interface is erased. the human interface is gotten rid of. So, that is why this is non-participatory, in the sense that the human no longer needs to participate and debate in setting the agenda. It is not being set by the news recipient, it is not being set by broadcast houses or corporations either. So, these are robots, these are bots and algorithms who function as the interface, and that determines what we are going to get on our news feed, on our phones, on our gadgets as news. So, the audience's internal relation, as in the audience relation in the context of algorithmic journalism, is therefore algorithmic and quantifiable. Having discussed this tabular pattern here among these 4 sets of journalism, what I am trying to draw your attention is to the fact, see the changes here. So, it is kind of evolutionary, if we may call it. This is some sort of an evolution of media from traditional to the new formats, internet compliant formats. So, this atomistic consumption of news has, with algorithmic journalism, with the internet compliable journalism, with the bots and algorithms, is now largely algorithmic, not largely, it is totally probable, it is totally algorithmic and quantifiable. Whereas, the audience's relationship to journalism, which in the context of the professional journalism was consumptive and passive, this is now non-participatory and atomized. Now, we are in the next course of our discussion, we are going to speak about this concept of spherules, which is very important in the context of the evolution of media and media technologies. So, we are going to speak of spherules as opposed to atoms, and we are going to see how the emancipatory rhetoric of participatory media, new media, Web 2.0, so to say, has also atomized our subjectivity in spherular forms, and how our consumption of the new media is to a large extent function in spherules. So, the emancipatory rhetoric, the participatory rhetoric of the new media is often premised on its fundamental nature of being interactive. So, when we were discussing this, we were telling like it is the participatory, like people are now, the audience is now empowered to set their own agenda, to debate and negotiate issues, because most of these internet based new media platforms are interactive. So, this is one very prominent characteristic that we ascribe to new media. So, this emancipatory rhetoric is fundamentally premised on our ability as consumers, our ability to interact, to participate. So, with versions of artificial intelligence, it is true though that the extent of interaction has deepened to a large extent, like the way the more we are progressing, the more is the ubiquity of the new media, the more we are able to interact, the more we are able to participate. Like if you think of e-governance, if you think of the notions of digital governance, digital India, which have been in the air for the last few years, you would know like the app based governance, mobile apps that are endorsed by the government, and that helps in dispensing certain civil amenities, and the whole issue around the Aadhaar card and so on and so forth. Like this is illustrative of the fact that how deepening our inclination to participate is with the advent of the new media. So, however, with the availability of complex degree of programming, with a very complex sense of artificial intelligence, complex programming, so the bots, the robots, we have discussed this before, the bots of all sorts can now simulate human like conversations. So, if you like think of website based customer service, like there are bots who like think of phone calls, like phone based customer service or web based customer service, where bot and robots attends, where robots would attend to the customers. So, these are human like conversations which the bots can very effectively simulate. So, like there is this, what I am trying to suggest here is these are forms of conversation, these are forms of participation which are fairly effectively simulated by bots. With the removal of the human interface, the bots are taking over, like there are certain repetitive tasks which, as I said, the bots are better capable of performing. So, the point therefore, and we are going to examine this in the next course of our discussion, the point therefore is to recontextualize the rhetoric of interactivity, because on the one hand this, see, there is this dichotomy here. On the one hand, we are saying the new media is participative, the new media is participatory, the new media is democratic, the new media is social in the sense that it empowers the audience. On the other hand, most of this participation is reliant upon bots. We are going to recontextualize this rhetoric of interactivity, the implications of new media's endorsement of the same, because I am calling this endorsement because the new media cannot function without bots. Like for example, if the news media houses, if Google Images, if Google News for example do not rely upon bots, internet based platforms, news platforms like Google News has to depend on bots to dispense and supply the news they are doing. So, we are trying to evaluate this rhetoric of interactivity, because there are two phases involved here, like the bots allow us to interact, number one, but then also the bots take away the human subjectivity, they take away the human interactivity. So, there is a dyad here, there is a dichotomy here. So, we are going to recontextualize and re-evaluate this rhetoric of interactivity, this rhetoric of participation and democratization, and make sense of what relations of power, control and autonomy is eventually being endorsed by the diffusion of interactivity and the adoption of technologies by the users. So, let me tell you, and this is one point that I touched upon at the onset when we began the course, like we tend to generally assume, it is a human tendency to assume that things, technologies or artifacts that are more recent are better than the older ones. This is a tendency, what is in shorthand referred to as the So, what we are trying to get at here is the notion of incremental progress, and this is something that we touched upon in right at the onset of when we began the course. This notion of incremental progress in short is referred to as our tendency to believe in that whatever that comes recently is better than what came before it. So, whatever technological element, whatever technology, whatever artifacts that we have recently, we tend to assume that these are better than things that existed before this. So, this is what we call like incremental progress. So, we are, if you see the diagram here, we are so gradually it's kind of a it's kind of a step here, it's kind of a vertical step that is progressing. So, so we assume that we, like for example, when we are in standard 12, we assume that we are already better than what we were when we were in standard 5. So, this is a belief, this is a reliance on having progressed, like this is an obsession with betterment. So, this is an idea referred to as the notion of incremental progress. So, we believe that we are naturally progressing. So, the latest electronic gadget is a better gadget. So, for example, the iPhone 10 we believe is already better than iPhone 6 for example. So, this is naturally assumed, and which is why I have called this So, what I am trying to draw your attention is to this element of naturalization here. So, the rhetoric of interactivity and democratization, so these also are commonly ascribed to the new media with the assumption that these are necessarily better. The earlier media, the professional journalism for example, the public journalism for example, these were not so good. Like once we have in the media, once we have algorithmic journalism, we tend to believe these are democratic, these are socializing, these are interactive, and therefore, these are better. And this is a naturalized belief which has got to do with our tendency, with our disposition to the belief of incremental progress. So, we in the next course of the lectures, we are trying to recontextualize and re-evaluate this rhetoric of betterment. We are going to re-evaluate this rhetoric of interactivity, participatoriness, democratization, and in doing so we are also problematizing the idea of incremental progress, which deems the new media naturally better than the old forms of media. We are going to place this in history and context, and we are going to re-evaluate